We're also joined by Mr. Peter Yo. Mr. Yo serves as president of the Better World Campaign. Mr. Yo, I apologize if I have mispronounced your name. I think I have correctly pronounced it, and you may proceed with your statement.
You got it right.
All right.
Thank you. Chairman Young, Ranking Member Merkley, thank you for the opportunity to explain how the United Nations furthers the values and the priorities of the United States. Over the past decade, I've been fortunate to see the life-saving work of the United Nations in more than 24 countries around the world, many emerging from conflict and disaster. Last November, I traveled to Mali, where UN peacekeepers opposed no less than 6 terrorist organizations, offshoots of ISIS and Al-Qaeda, each fighting for territory and the overthrow of a democratically elected government in a strategic area for us. In Jordan, the United Nations Refugee Agency provides shelter for more than 500,000 Syrian refugees, while the UN Population Fund, working in the largest refugee camp, has safely delivered more than 10,000 babies with 0 maternal mortality. In Mexico, the UN Office of Drugs and Crime helps fight against opioids by tracking illicit crop production, working with the Mexican Army to locate and destroy nearly 200,000 plots of poppies in 2017. In Yemen, one of the world's worst humanitarian disasters, the World Food Program feeds 12 million people per month, while UNICEF and the World Health Organization are responding to a massive cholera outbreak. Now, the member states of the UN finance these many operations through both assessed and voluntary contributions. While the U.S. is the largest single financial contributor to the UN system, the current model is ultimately beneficial to the United States, as it requires all UN member states, no matter how big or small, how rich or poor, to help shoulder the burden of the UN's regular and peacekeeping budgets. Some have suggested that moving to an entirely voluntary funding model would lead to more accountability and cost effectiveness. It won't. It's more likely to increase the amount of money spent by the U.S. taxpayers as they are saddled with more expenses. Let me explain. Our country, under Democratic and Republican administrations alike, has a very broad definition of its foreign policy and national security interests. That's why we support peacekeepers in Mali and the UN's negotiators in Yemen. It's also why we support investigating human rights situation in North Korea and support programs that stop the flow of opioids into our country. All of these efforts are funded by assessed contributions to the UN. Few UN member states, including Russia and China, share this expansive view of national interests and would not shoulder the burden voluntarily. Now, as it stands, though, we are one of the few member states not fully paying our assessed contributions for either the UN regular budget or peacekeeping. These shortfalls have contributed to what the Secretary General has deemed a financial crisis at the UN. Right now, on peacekeeping alone, we are $776 million in arrears, a shortfall that the Senate Appropriations Committee stated last year damages U.S. credibility and negatively impacts UN peacekeeping missions. At the same time that the U.S. is underfunding operations, the stock of our rivals, particularly China, is rising at the UN, as has been discussed extensively. China is now the second largest financial contributor to UN peacekeeping, its assessment rate having risen to 15% this year from just 3% 10 years ago. So in the UN context, increased Chinese support for the UN has boosted Chinese influence, as it would in any large organization, with dues-paying shareholders. While the U.S. has withdrawn from several key UN bodies, China has increased its leadership and now holds the top jobs in 4 of the UN's 15 specialized agencies. The Chinese government has also become increasingly assertive at promoting its vision of human rights, which of course values the state over the rights of the individual, in bodies like the Human Rights Council, in which we no longer participate. China is seeking to use the UN to promote the Belt and Road Initiative involving infrastructure investments in more than 60 countries. The right response to the rise of China in the UN is clear. First, the U.S. should boost our level of involvement in UN agencies. Sadly, the State Department office that pushes U.S. participation in international organizations was cut from 5 staff to 0. Second, we should engage in the UN system rather than withdraw from it when the U.S. doesn't achieve all of its negotiating objectives, a position backed by nearly 60% of Americans in polling last summer. Third, the U.S. should pay its dues on time and in full. China has paid its regular and peacekeeping dues. The U.S., meanwhile, is set to be $1 billion in arrears by next year unless Congress acts. As the State Department stated in a report to Congress this summer, such shortfalls resulted in diminished U.S. standing and the ability to pursue U.S. priorities. Simply put, the other 192 UN member states are more likely to vote with the U.S., support its candidates for key UN positions, and quietly push against Chinese initiatives if the U.S. is seen as being fully engaged and supportive player. This is the time to work cooperatively with the UN and other like-minded UN member states to focus on implementation of the Secretary General's ambitious reform agenda, which has been approved with active Trump administration support. And this also means American leadership to ensure that the UN remains as much in America's image as it did when we crafted the UN Charter with our allies nearly 75 years ago. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Yo, for your instructive testimony.
Mr. Yo?
Yep.
So the U.S. thought 25% was a reasonable number to contribute, 1/4 of the total cost. And the arrears you spoke of were because the UN continues to assess the U.S. almost 28%. I believe that's the main driver of those arrears. 25%, I think, to anyone back home in Oregon sound like, oh, we're contributing 1/4. Isn't that a fair amount?
Sounds reasonable to me, except that the U.S. voted in December to support an assessment rate for the U.S. of 27.8%. So these rates are negotiated every 3 years. We had an opportunity in December of last year to reduce the U.S. rate. And so Nikki Haley was engaged in active negotiations, and they got the rate down from roughly 28.2 to 27.8. But we negotiated this rate. We also have the opportunity to veto any peacekeeping mission that we view as too expensive or too costly. And so when we vote for these missions, and we just voted for the mission in Central African Republic last week, so we vote for these missions, we agreed to this assessment rate. And so it seems to me that under those circumstances, we need to pay.
Thank you. That's a very interesting piece of information, because I'm surprised to hear that we voted for those rates, since we've had a long-standing cap at 25%. I think the United States feels, but I'll ask you, that often these peacekeeping missions do a pretty effective job in very difficult places in the world. Is that a fair way to put it?
Absolutely. They're operating in countries in which the U.S. and our European allies in general do not wish to operate. So in the case of Central African Republic, the mission there has played a vital role in ensuring the prevention of a genocide between various religious and ethnic groups. And as we approach elections in Central African Republic next year, they would not happen without UN peacekeepers, as well as the sort of negotiations that occur to bring all the relevant parties together. So this is just a specific case where UN peacekeepers are advancing our interests.
Do you think we're going to see a lot more challenges as a result of climate chaos and the impact on basic agriculture in the world? For example, in Syria, extended drought resulted in people moving to the cities because they were starving. That created conflict, and it was kind of the roots of the Syrian war. Or I was just down in the Northern Triangle, where extended drought has driven people out of peasant villages. They go to the cities where there's extraordinarily gang-style extortion, and they flee north. Are we going to see a lot more conflict driven by fundamental challenges for food in the world?
Absolutely. We're already seeing it. I mentioned I was in Mali, and a lot of the conflict in northern Mali, but also in Central African Republic, is due to changed migration patterns and changed herding practices as a result of climate change. So absolutely, there's a relationship between what's happening in terms of conflict between villagers that used to get along, groups that used to get along but no longer do because of tighter resources caused by climate change.
Are we still in Cyprus?
Yes, we have a very small mission in Cyprus, and ultimately the resolution of the mission in Cyprus is dependent upon some sort of broader political settlement. It is not a costly mission. As we think about the drivers and the cost of
I was going to
peacekeeping,
say, it
Cyprus is
seems
not-
like that's not exactly one of the trouble spots in the world right now. It's been pretty stable for a while.
Indeed. I think that to the extent that the U.S. makes an effort to have systematic, high-level dialogue with our key allies on human rights issues and understand how we're going to collectively respond to the human rights challenges posed by countries such as China, the UN is just one mechanism that we can work collectively on this. I think the other suggestion I'd make is we need to send our best diplomats to work in a multilateral context, and they need to be trained in multilateral diplomacy. And when multilateral diplomacy is a unique bird in terms of understanding how you assemble coalitions behind the scenes to tackle important issues like human rights. And so to the extent that we can actually incentivize the State Department to send our best diplomats to work in these settings and then train them well, it can have better outcomes on human rights issues. I would just say that the work of the Human Rights Council has continued. And what's happened is you've seen important measures related to Yemen and North Korea and Syria being adopted in the Human Rights Council, even though the U.S. is not a member of it. The challenge is the UN Human Rights Council remains the preeminent global body in which not only countries in Europe but around the world look towards for standard setting and statements related to human rights, and we're not participating.
So this is the preeminent. Cuba, China, Venezuela, they all had seats on the council. Venezuela was a member in 2015, right. and the council invited Maduro to speak at the Special Assembly, and he got a standing O.
There's absolutely no doubt about it that these membership rules for the UN Human Rights Council creates a situation where there are countries on there that don't share our values. That said, all this important work is still happening. We should be participating in this work in the Human Rights Council, advancing our interests as it relates to Venezuela and to Syria and to North Korea, as opposed to taking a walk and saying, well, we didn't get everything we wanted, we're out. I think we need to stay engaged, try to get what we want, continue to push for reform, because you're right. It doesn't make sense that human rights abusers are a member of the Human Rights Council. Let's fix it.